Welcome to Authentic Living with Roxanne, a place where we have conscious conversations about things that really matter in our lives. And now here's your host, Roxanne Derhodge.
Hi, everyone. It's Roxanne Derhodge. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Today, I have a colleague, Emily Nichols, and Emily and I are privileged to be able to be members of the Canadian Association of Professional Speakers. Emily, welcome to Authentic Living with Roxanne.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here.
I was actually able to spend some in-person time with Emily this last weekend, where we had our social for CAPS, like we call it, in my backyard, which was amazing just to catch up with everyone. So Emily brings an amazing background, and I often say that it's amazing that we have the younger generation coming up, and some of the things that she may have potentially or will be touching on in her career, I've probably lived with for a lot longer, being just a wee bit older than Emily. And today, Emily is a professional, a keynote speaker, and a professional engineer. So one of the fields that impacts what she does with her speaking today. And she's the owner of a company called Technical Skills for Professional People. Am I getting that wrong, Emily?
Human skills for technical people.
Oh my goodness. I just said to her, make sure, keep me on track. And of course I went off track. So Emily, welcome, welcome, welcome. And I'm excited because Emily did something which most of us as speakers are going to do, or are scared to do, or will be doing hopefully soon. She did a TED Talk, which was amazing. And we will put the link in the show notes. But Emily, let's start there, because I think let's just dive in on the deep end of the pool and talk a little bit about what made you think that you needed to share the message that you shared with your TED Talk. Maybe tell people a little bit about it, and then we'll dive right in.
Sure. So the title of the TED Talk is "What If We Didn't Have to Be One of the Guys?" And that talk, I've been telling people, it's been on my mind for months before the TEDx actually happened, but on my heart for years. And it was a slow realization that I came to in my career, because I was quite comfortable being one of the guys in the early years. I was quite happy to, do what I needed to fit in and blend in. And it didn't even really seem like that much of an inconvenience. But I expected equal treatment. And I would say that in the early years, I mostly got it. But over time, these small ways that, you don't quite feel part of the group, you get a little bit left out, it kind of adds up. And there was a turning point, in 2015, I was interviewed for National Engineering Month. And I mentioned this in my TED Talk. They asked me, Emily, what is your dream for women in engineering in the next 25 years? And I thought, holy cow, why should there have to be a dream for women in engineering at all? I didn't ask to be a woman in engineering. I just wanted to be an engineer. And, I don't even want to think about needing a 25-year time frame to get to gender parity. I mean, it's just something that we should have now, and we should have equal treatment now. And we should be able to be ourselves at work without having to be one of the guys now. So, being interviewed in 2015 kind of got my mind a little bit on this thinking. And then, things evolved. And actually, the catalyst was that TEDx McMaster U decided that their theme for TEDx this year was going to be legacy. And, when we think about legacy, we often think that it needs to be something big. We need to have a lot of money. We need to do a lot of philanthropy. But I knew that with this topic, I had something that would allow people to create a legacy one conversation at a time, simply by changing their words.
So let's let's talk a little bit about your background. You talk a little bit about it, and I loved your story about your mom. And obviously, you were seeing females in a very powerful way from a very, very young age. So tell us a little bit about kind of your inspiration. And I could picture your mom in her muckalucks, driving the tractor with three little girls, kind of, and you were being like the little ducklings that were kind of imprinting kind of some of the things that you would have seen with her. But tell us a little bit about your mom and the impact or potential kind of correlation between what you do today and kind of the role that you saw your mom play.
Sure. So I come from a farming family, and I grew up on the same farm where my mom grew up, actually. We moved back to the home farm when I was about 8 years old, and we farmed as a family. So there really weren't too many gender roles to observe, really, when it came to the farm work. My mom and dad were both out there doing what needed to be done. And, you talk about my mom driving the tractor, the visual that comes to my mind is when it was harvest time. And, back when we used to take the grain to town in wagons, my mom would drive wagons to town to take the grain to the elevator. And the only other people in the lineup there at the elevator were men. And I always felt a sense of pride that, my mom could do anything. And she had grown up also with only sisters. So you see, this was the second generation where there actually weren't any boys around. So as a young kid, I didn't really begin to understand that there were expected differences in terms of gender roles at work until, gosh, I don't know, later on in elementary school, I suppose.
Wow, amazing. And likewise, my background is I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, very traditional kind of situation. My mom stayed at home with us, and my dad was a high level executive most of my life. But I was always told, there was five girls and one boy, that anything that I wanted to do was possible. So for me, like you, I grew up with all my male cousins, climbing trees and, making experiments with things in the backyard and contraptions and stuff like that. But also in my formative year, I went to a school, which was an old girls school, and it was academically driven. It was based on your marks that you went to this high school. And they made us believe that anything was possible. And in the British system, because Trinidad, was under the British system, we had houses that we all belonged to, and these were all rooted to your sports days, and they were all named after famous women. So,
so cool.
at 11, here you are, kind of learning the possibilities and of course, my, Caribbean, oftentimes I was very, very traditional, right, in their roles, but I was being exposed like you to some things, even though my mom stayed at home with us. Our brother, oftentimes had to compete with us because it was five girls and one boy, right? So we would make him do the things we wanted to do. So it's interesting how some of those formative little visions in your brain, or even exposure, is what it does, and then ultimately some of the career that you picked, which was in engineering.
Mm-hmm.
So let's dive into language, because I love this. I'm not just saying this, but because we are professional speakers, we have to look at people speak. So I sat down the other day and got quiet and spent the time looking at this TED Talk. And the message that bore through was the impact of language. So I want you to share a little bit about how language impacts the capacity for us to move forward in reference to the arena of parity.
Sure. So the premise is that language is a signal to everyone around us about what we're thinking. And it's also a reflection of the expectations we have in our minds. So, my TED Talk is about gendered language. So let's talk about the word guys. That is kind of one of the focal points of my talk. that word gets thrown around a lot in our society, and not even just in fields like engineering and manufacturing, but I mean everywhere, because probably, Roxanne, the last time you went to a restaurant, servers are notorious for this. Hey guys, how we doing tonight, guys? Like, and it's, so you do hear it everywhere, and it can seem like, oh, well, it's harmless. Like maybe some of your listeners are even thinking now, like, okay, so what does that matter? A server greets you as, hey guys, at the restaurant. I think there are lots of scenarios where we accept it as being a gender neutral word, and that's fine, fair enough. But when you're working in a factory, as I have for many years, and you are the only or one of the few women, this word starts to be an emblem of the ways that you get kind of ignored a little bit or left out. You hear about manpower meetings and man hours, and there are lots of assumptions made there. One of the places I worked, we were always trying to fill each role or all the shifts, with guys. I need 6 guys for this. I need 4 guys over there, and so when I say that our words are a reflection of our thinking, most of us, when we use guys in that context, where the roles have been traditionally filled by men, then that word allows our brains to continue to expect those roles to be filled by men, right? And so it reflects the way that we're thinking. It doesn't open our minds to, I say in my TED Talk, the full spectrum of people that could do the job. And so I started to notice how that word guys got thrown around in terms of filling positions, in terms of who can finish a special project, who has the special skills for something. I need a guy. Do you know a guy? These kind of things come up a lot. And so in my talk, I'm trying to show people, first of all, what is the feeling when you're hearing that word and it doesn't really include you? Second of all, what's the bigger implication? And then third, what can we do instead? Right. So the bigger implication, I like to remind people that our words, well, again, another of the lines from my TED Talk, words shape our world, right? So it's really this connection between language and actual concrete concerns, like, do we have personal protective equipment that fits? Now, for some of your listeners, that might seem like a pretty big leap, but think about a woman in construction and manufacturing, where really they are one of the only or one of the few on the site or in the plant. Personal protective equipment tends not to fit women very well. I'm talking about things like safety glasses and respirators and coveralls and boots, all the things. And if safety equipment doesn't fit well, it's not safe, right? And so I'm just trying to make this connection between when we say guys all the time, when we throw that word around all the time, what do we end up ordering and keeping in stores? The personal protective equipment that fits men. And what kind of a building do we end up building? The one that has the washrooms and change rooms and facilities for men. In our public buildings these days, we actually have regulations telling us how many washrooms we need for, well, in the past we would have said for both genders, but we're managing that in different ways these days. But there are actually no regulations that say in private buildings whether we have to build a washroom or a change room for women. And I've worked in several that didn't have equal facilities for women. So it starts with our words, and certainly that gives us that feeling of inclusion, but our words are then connected to these other concrete concerns that we can actually point to in the world.
It's interesting, right? So I was an executive in health and wellness for 20 years. And I'll give you a scenario, Emily. And then, of course, I'm an executive. I'm on bid teams. I was in business development and account management. And we went in to bid for, let's say, the municipality for their business. And I was the main person that was presenting. So I go in and, you do your setup, everybody meets everybody. And I am the only woman on the bid team. And there's a board we're presenting to that's 100% men. So as we're coming in and I'm, presenting and starting to present, 2 of the men on that's on the board start to talk to two of the men that are on the bid team. And the crossover was something related to a sport. And that derailed the entire presentation.
Oh,
In what happened was, and we're talking psychological services that we're talking for in a municipality, but it's interesting how you could see the shift sometimes in just a context of that. And it's not a predominantly male-dominated environment. It just happened to be that I was on a pitch team that week that was predominantly male, and how and then I had to basically corral the crowd back, even though I was the main focal point with all the information about the actual business. So it's interesting. It does play out, to your point, around presence, and then in turn, how things can just get shifted because of commonality. And of course, what was a sport? Let's guess. It was hockey, because it's a Canadian company. And so that happens so much in other arenas, but in a mostly male predominantly industry, I've been in those environments, but to work in it, I can see how language can create such a shift if we all start to think about what incremental role we can, each and every one of us can make in reference to language. So let's talk a little bit. You talked a little bit about the call to action for men in our lives. So tell me a little bit about what you think would be helpful for men that can kind of move, the needle around further along in reference to language.
well, it's like this, Roxanne. When people hear me or see me, a woman in engineering, speaking about being a woman in engineering, they often jump to the assumption that my target audience is women in engineering. And I'm so glad you asked this question, because my target audience is not primarily women in engineering. Certainly, I'm hearing from some women that this is an empowering message, that it's helpful, that they can relate, that they feel like they're not the only one, and that's fantastic. But I really think that, well, only less than 15% of practicing engineers in Canada are women. So if I was only speaking to the women, I can't move the needle that much, right? So that's the first thing, is that just by sheer numbers, we need men to pay attention. We need men to participate in making more gender equal workplaces and making women more welcome. Their words shape our world simply because of numbers, and it's it's a challenge for men. They're by and large are in workplaces that work just fine for them. And sometimes I say that when business as usual works well for you, it's really hard to see how business as usual is not working well for other people. So starting with language is a great place to start. Dropping that word, guys. Stop lumping the women in with the men. We don't necessarily want to always just have to fit in and blend in. And let's not forget non-binary folks as well, right? We're not talking about a gender binary anymore. And I made that point in my TED talk as well, because sometimes when people hear my message, they might be inclined to just revert to the old ladies and gentlemen as a greeting, right? And so I wanted to remind people that that's not very inclusive either. And if for a demonstration of why, I guess the thing is that I'm advocating for less gendered language, because I would love to see a less gendered workplace. You talk about being in this bid meeting and being the only woman in the room. And, sometimes I find that if you're the only woman in the room at work, we have challenges with that, like you described, but it's manageable. We can navigate it. Now, when the work world intersects with social occasions, now it gets really confusing. One sales trip that I sometimes tell this story, I went on a sales trip. I was a senior leader in manufacturing, and I went with the salesperson to visit a client, and we arrived there the evening before we were going to have the meeting. So we all went out for dinner together. So now I'm meeting the client for the first time, and it's dinner. So I decided I was going to wear a skirt that evening. And the assumption of the people we were meeting was that I was the salesman's wife. And that's just that I find that really frustrating that you're expected to, at work you can get by, you can dress kind of neutral or whatever, and you're not going to be wearing skirts in a factory, so no big deal there. But then in a social occasion, the idea of being a woman, people kind of expect you to dress in a certain way. Or if you do, then they decide that you're not part of the business. You see what I'm saying? Like it's confusing to navigate. We just need the men in our lives to use inclusive language and open their minds to the many ways there are to be a woman, or better yet, like, let's leave gender out of it. There are lots of situations where we can leave gender out of it. Not that I'm saying we should leave gender behind, because it's important when we talk about fit for personal protective equipment and things like that. But when we're thinking about a job and who can do the job or who we expect to be in the job, it doesn't need to be a gendered thing.
Well, I remember reading Malcolm Gladwell's book, and he talked about maestros. I don't know if you've ever read that particular book. I forget which one it was in. And he talked about with maestros, right? Predominantly men. And what they did, they did the social experiments where they actually started to, put the maestros behind a white screen. And what happened was that a woman actually was the maestro behind the screen that won. And even after she won, what happened is everybody was still referring to her as Mr., even though clearly she had blown everybody out of the water. And she was trying to obviously put that point across that if you see me or you, Emily, we're going to automatically, make assumptions based on what we see, right? And, and we all have inbred biases that have come from our socialization. And there's so many things, and that experiment was brilliant in that what happened after that, the orchestras implemented that particular strategy so that then it was a blind audition. So nobody could make preconceived decisions prior to the maestro kind of going up there and, doing his or her thing. They just was not able to see the gender, the gender of the individual. And now it's something that's done globally with maestros. So that's an example of I'm going to say a systemic shift that, allowed people to recognize it's about, who's the best person with the skill to fit that position versus all these kind of inherent steps that we go through. Before we kind of get to the point where we get in front of that individual. And I found that very, very powerful. I believe it was for one of his first books that particular experiment was in.
Yeah, that's great. And so let's tie that back to language, right? It's an outcome. And so this is, again, why I'm talking about language is because it's something that's accessible to everybody. That's a great experiment. But some people will say, well, I'm not a leader, or I don't have a budget, or I don't make the policy, and that's why language is such a powerful thing. Again, going back to the call to action for the men in our lives. What if you start with your words, and by changing your words, you hopefully are changing your thoughts. I mean, usually the thoughts come first and then the words. And so if you notice the words, then that kind of works backwards to change the thoughts, and then forwards to change the words, and then the actions. Right. So if we change our words, then that becomes a signal to other people as well. And that's, what you're talking about with the maestros. We say the conductor, maybe, instead of the maestro, right? It's a little bit more gender neutral word, perhaps. And, I think it's really fun to figure out what are the words we can use instead. So I said in my talk, most of the time you can just drop the word guys. We think we need a word to fill in there. Most times you just don't need it. You don't need a word at all. But if you do need a word, and I ran out of time, a TED Talk has to be maximum 18 minutes. I have so much more to say about this, the kinds of words you could use instead, the ways you can be creative in terms of referring to people as a group by where they're from or what job they're doing, hey, podcasters, or, something like that. There are lots of fun things we can do. But yeah, it's great to start with the words, and it's a signal to everybody around you that you really are thinking about it. And this concept didn't come to me accidentally, you know, Roxanne. It's my husband is an engineer as well, and we've been together 20 years anyway, and I've been correcting him for a long time. Anytime there was a generic, like anytime he was referring to somebody who was not physically present, like, you know, the delivery guy, the landscape guy or something, you know, well, are you sure it's a guy? I would always ask him this, like anytime it happened. Did you see the person? Do you know for sure? So this is a neat way to kind of disrupt people's thinking without being, you know, too critical, because you don't want, I like to do it as an invitation, right? I don't want to go around shooting on people. I like to do it as an invitation. So, you know, adding a little humor, asking people, well, are you sure that was really a guy? Then it kind of works.
This was such a great interview that we decided to turn it into a 2-part series. Be sure to tune in next week for part 2, so you don't miss out on the amazing content.
Thanks for tuning in to Authentic Living with Roxanne, creating the space for positive, healthy change. Roxanne is a keynote speaker, psychotherapist, and coach. To work with Roxanne, visit roxannederhage.com/blueprint. We'll see you next time on Authentic Living with Roxanne.